So good morning, good afternoon. I am so very pleased to have the opportunity to reopen our webinar series towards the creation of what we're going to call Canada's Rare Drug Strategy 2022, and really pleased to have a really stellar group of panelists here. I'm going to try to see if I can figure out how to share my screen though, because what I see is all the participants, but I don't actually see my own screen. Let me see if I can figure this out. So,
Durhan, you're sharing your screen. We can see it.
I am sharing the screen now. Okay, so great. I think we're just about ready to start. I'll give it maybe another minute or so to get everybody on board and get us into talking about our subject for today. Maybe just as we're coming up to it, I'll do a little bit of a backgrounding because I think many of you have been with us before and may actually know the introduction to this. We do call it the countdown to Canada's Rare Drug Strategy. We're taking the opportunity now to set this up because next year, 2021, we will be in full mode, consultation mode. Towards trying to develop and define what we believe a rare disease drug strategy ought to look like to be in position for 2022. So this is just by way of introduction. I'm Durhan Wong-Rieger, the President and CEO of the Canadian Organization for Rare Diseases. We are actually now, as I say, on a countdown towards what will be a full year of consultation to take an advantage of what we call the rare opportunity of a lifetime. Right now, we are looking at a lot of things that have lined up towards our ability to hopefully create what will be a first in the world, as far as we can tell, a wholly dedicated program agency towards bringing in rare drugs for patients with rare diseases. And this began, we saw this past year, October 2020, the Patent Medicine Price Review Board came out with their new guidelines with the goal towards rare diseases of having non-excessive pricing for rare disease drugs. Importantly, in September 2020, we heard in this speech from the throne, a recommitment from the federal government to having an overall rare disease strategy that would actually encompass this optimal drug access for patients with rare diseases. This, of course, followed on the 2019 February commitment from the federal government of $1 billion to setting up a national rare disease drug program to be put in place by 2022. In June 2019, I think many of you know, many people participated in the consultations led by Dr. Hoskins, resulting in a proposal of PharmaCare for All, which also committed in there to a distinct pathway for the consideration of expensive drugs for rare diseases, which included in their recommendations a national expert panel to work with patients and their families to determining which rare disease drugs should be funded for which patients. In November of 2018, many of you will have participated with us when we did our consultations following the announcement of the Provincial Territorial Expensive Drugs for Rare Diseases Working Group that the provinces and territories would develop a supplemental process for managed access to complex specialty drugs, including the rare disease drugs. So this again was defining of a distinct pathway for drugs for rare diseases, and within then Health Canada, their production as part of the modernization of the drug regulatory process, a designated regulatory approach to drugs for rare diseases. So we feel like we're really at a very auspicious time where many things have come together for us to be able to take advantage of bringing in a unique program pathway for the access to drugs for patients living with rare diseases. Which brings us to kind of what we've been doing over this past fall, starting in October 9th, where we introduced again the call for an orphan drug policy, to where we are today, to really, I think, a very, very important topic, and that is how do we make sure that in this rare drug strategy, we leave no one behind, that we are going to be as inclusive as possible. So we're going to bring you today 2 case studies, or 2, they're more than studies, they're actually 2 examples of patient populations that really, provide for us a window into some of the challenges when we talk about the rarest of the rare. So this is just, a consultation process that we're taking on. So, we will have a national consultation forum, which will be taking place December the 16th, 2020. So hopefully many of you or all of you will join us for that one day. You'll be seeing more around it. There's been a notice sent out for the registration, and we'll be providing you with the agenda for that day very shortly. Starting next year, we will be doing 2 series of consultations. One is what we call hot topics and pivotal challenges. Again, our concerns to make sure that as we're setting up this rare drug strategy, that we're going to be as inclusive as possible, but we're also going to be able to deal with some of the challenges that we know rare disease drugs present for everyone from the patients to the clinicians, but also to the health systems and certainly to the payers in terms of getting it right. We will also be hosting along that same time a series of consultations that will be province by province, understanding the nuances that are particular to not only the patients and the families in the specific provinces, but also to those that are providing the services and those that are actually reimbursing the drugs. We'll have a consolidated feedback by May 2021. And then taking the time through the summer to actually do more consultations through surveys and focus groups. And hopefully by the end of October, we'd have a proposal that is representative of the consultations that we've heard, with the goal of having a proposal that could in fact be the basis for a rare drug. Well, we're hoping by that time more than a strategy, but actually a program. So in this case, what we want to do is making sure that we are able to, as we say, leave no one behind. The rarest is rare. What are the key issues we're going to be addressing in this forum? How can we provide access to treatments for specific subgroups of population? So even though we're dealing with rare diseases, we know that within those rare diseases, there are also subpopulations that are oftentimes not included in access or reimbursement protocols because they were not part of the original clinical trials, or they're not part of the value assessment submissions, or excluded specifically from those value assessments. And they may actually also represent those subgroups that have limited evidence of effectiveness in real world settings. What are then the challenges and that we will learn from these populations, and what are some of the solutions that we need to consider if we're going to ensure that as we're setting up a pan-Canadian rare drug strategy that actually does leave no one behind. So our panelists today are actually quite a good cross group from our specialists, Dr. Rebecca Dial from BC Children's Hospital, Antonia Palmer, who is the head of a patient organization that deals specifically with these issues, Dr. Kirby and Elizabeth, who represent both, I guess, experts and parents of a patient, and then 2 expert patients that are going to be talking about a very specific condition as well. So these are the 2 cases that we've got. Combination therapy for patients that are refractory relapsed neuroblastoma, and also then 2 patients, experts are going to be talking about access to kalydeco treatment for pediatric cystic fibrosis patients, specifically those carrying the mutation, the R117H. So this will be the basis for the discussion that we have. These are some of the questions that we'll have at the end in terms of the discussions, and we will engage with both the experts and with the parent panelists that are on there. What are the indications for extensions? What's been experienced with the therapy? What are the alternatives? And how effective are these? And what are the possible ways forward to making this therapy available? So with that, I'm going to actually close my screen, hopefully, and be able to turn it over to Dr. Rebecca Dial from BC Children's Hospital, who's going to give us an overview in terms of the case for the extension of combination unituxin therapy for children with a refractory and relapse neuroblastoma. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and hopefully we'll be able to get Rebecca's slides up.
Perfect. Thank you so much for the introduction and for inviting me to participate today. It's a great opportunity. Thank you also to Shane and Elizabeth who allowed me to convince them to join me. They're parents of one of my patients, and so I think we'll hear from them shortly. Let me see if I'm allowed to share my screen. Just looking for oh, there we go. The invitation. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So I really wanted to take this opportunity to really give you an introduction today to high-risk neuroblastoma and also the role for immunotherapy, and specifically combining immunotherapy with chemotherapy, which is specifically what we're talking about for relapsed or refractory patients. I do work at BC Children's Hospital. I'm one of the pediatric oncologists there. And as far as disclosures go, I do have some advisory board roles, not related actually to dinutuximab, and I have served on clinical guidance panels for PCODER. So I just wanted to start off with a little bit of a background for those of you who may not be familiar with neuroblastoma. What is it? How do we treat it? How does immunotherapy fit in for kids who are first diagnosed, and then what about for kids who have relapsed or refractory disease? So just as a bit of a background, neuroblastoma is a childhood cancer. It's actually the most common solid tumor outside of brain tumors in infancy, and one of the most common solid tumors of childhood. And it arises from the peripheral nervous system. So it can present in lots of different places in the body. Typically can show up with an abdominal mass arising in the adrenal gland, but it can also turn up in along the spinal cord. It can spread to bones and bone marrow, as well as to the liver. And so kids can present in a variety of different ways. It is rare, but of course, in a tertiary pediatric care institution, we do see patients quite frequently. So the epidemiology is about 8 children per million per year under 15 years of age who have all kinds of neuroblastoma, and I'll explain there's actually quite a big difference between those that have high risk and those that have lower intermediate risk. It is common, and again, I think the median age of diagnosis is about 17 or 18 months. So these are young children for the most part. It is one of the leading causes still of childhood cancer mortality, and so there's actually, a big challenge ahead of us for those kids with high-risk neuroblastoma. We have made ground in the past years, and I'll explain how that's been done. But there's really still a lot more work to do and room to improve on outcomes for our patients. So this is basically just to show you that children are young when they're first diagnosed. About half of them are under the age of 18 months. And we break down neuroblastoma into risk groups, and that's really based on our understanding of the biology of the disease. And you can see just under half, about 42% of children are classified as having high-risk disease, which is really the most challenging group. These are kids that, in spite of some of the most intensive therapy we use across pediatric oncology, still have a high risk for relapse or having disease that just doesn't respond. And so this is just to show you, this was putting together outcomes for kids from 1990 to 2010, just looking at the differences in event-free survival. So this is basically the chance of relapse. And you can see there's quite a big difference between kids that are classified as low or intermediate risk, and those children with high-risk disease have an event-free survival based on this historical data of about 30%, meaning that only 30% of them won't relapse. Of course, I think those numbers are a bit better these days, and I will explain why that is. I just want you to get a sense of what do we do? How do we treat high-risk neuroblastoma if a patient is first diagnosed? This is our kind of standard roadmap. It looks a bit complicated, and it is, as Shane and Elizabeth can tell you. But really, it's one of the longest strategies in all of pediatric oncology. The whole initial plan takes about 18 months. At the start, there are these 5 rectangles which represent blocks of chemotherapy, multiple chemotherapy agents. We collect healthy stem cells from these patients so that we can save them in the freezer and give them back later. The children have a surgery, if possible, to resect some, if not all, of their tumor. Often it's hard to resect all of the primary tumor. And then these days, through COG, through clinical trials, we've learned that high-dose chemotherapy followed by stem cell transplant helps to improve outcome. And actually, in recent years, looking at whether 2 high-dose transplants are better than 1, we found that there is some improvement in survival if we do this twice. So this is a very intensive kind of treatment. It involves, a long stay in the hospital, lots of side effects, and then we give kids back their healthy stem cells. Once they finish all of that, then they go on to receive radiation therapy to their primary tumor and sometimes to other sites. And then finally, in this maintenance phase of upfront therapy, you can see in the green box is where dinutuximab, which is also Unituxin, comes into play in maintenance in combination with cytokines. So typically, the study looked at both GM-CSF and IL-2 in combination with isotretinoin, which is also Accutane. And this is really standard of care in maintenance, and I will explain to you that this is now Health Canada approved and has been through the PCODER process. So what is dinutuximab? It's an antibody to a sugar called GD2 that's on the outside of neuroblastoma cells in the vast majority of neuroblastoma. It's also found on some normal tissue, including some peripheral nerves, which speaks to some of the side effects that come along with this therapy, which can include things like pain quite often. And again, this is just, Kaplan-Meiers, just to show you, this is the New England Journal publication from the big study, the phase 3 randomized study through the Children's Oncology Group that compared kids with high-risk neuroblastoma who got this antibody therapy in maintenance as opposed to those who didn't. And you can see that there's, a significant difference, about a 20% improvement in event-free survival and about 10% in overall survival. And this is just to highlight, this is, for us in pediatric oncology, this is quite a big study, 226 kids randomized. So this is pretty much as good as it's going to get as far as study size goes for these rare patient populations. And this is possible because we have this big international clinical trials network through the COG that we're big participants in Canadian sites. But the other thing just to point out is that you may say, well, those numbers actually look a lot better than what I said before, which is true. But in order to be eligible to even get on this study, you, as a patient, you had to initially have some response to your initial therapy. So kids who had primary refractory disease, who didn't respond to their initial therapy or got worse with their initial therapy, they wouldn't have been eligible for this study. So it's not a representation of all kids with neuroblastoma. This indication is now approved by Health Canada and has gone through the PCODER process. And so the final PCODER recommendation was issued in March of 2019 for conditional reimbursement. And so this is now, accepted as a standard of care. 5 cycles of antibody therapy in the setting of maintenance for high-risk neuroblastoma. But the question is, in all of our minds, does it actually work for kids who don't have, who have relapsed or hard to treat neuroblastoma? We know about 15% of kids never achieve that response to initial chemotherapy, or they even progress at the start. And then many other children with high-risk neuroblastoma may experience a relapse later on down the road. So does antibody therapy help for those kids? So there was a phase 2 study through the COG, which was actually a randomized pick the winner design, it was called, and it compared, you know, this chemotherapy that we actually use as kind of a standard backbone chemotherapy for relapse patients, irinotecan and temozolomide, with either this drug called temsirolimus or in combination with dinutuximab for patients with their very first relapse or refractory neuroblastoma. And it turns out that the kids who got randomized to the antibody arm did so much better. They had a response rate of 53% in that initial part of the study versus only 5% in the other arm, that it just wasn't ethical to continue randomizing. The randomization stopped and the rest of the children on the study went on to the antibody arm. It's a relatively small study when you think about adult oncology, and but recognizing this is a rare patient population, the total study had 53 patients in the end, and ultimately showed a combined response rate of about 42%, with another 42% having stable disease, which may also be a benefit. We can talk a bit about side effects, and Shane and Elizabeth certainly can, but things like fever, pain, diarrhea, which is a side effect of irinotecan, and low blood counts are seen fairly frequently with this. So just to say, you know, in the setting of relapsed or refractory neuroblastoma, that response rate of 42% is really better than anything else that we have as far as tools in our toolkit, things that we can use. And so in real life practice over the past several years now, since those early results of the phase 2 study have come out, pediatric oncologists in Canada and the US have really considered this combination of Unituxin with chemotherapy as our first line strategy in kids with either relapse or refractory disease. But of course, at this point in time, that's not the approved indication from Health Canada's perspective. And so that's actually undergoing review right now. So there has been a PCODER submission just this past week, or just over a week ago, for this indication for relapsed refractory neuroblastoma. So we will see how that goes. The numbers are smaller, but as I say, there's this real world experience that is definitely out there. And antibody therapy itself in neuroblastoma is not going away within the COG. We're studying how do we incorporate antibody therapy earlier on into the treatment of kids with high-risk neuroblastoma. And there are studies ongoing about different kinds of anti-GD2 antibodies that are in the pipes. So I think I'll stop there and hand it back to Dorhane.
So thank you so very, very much, Rebecca. That is
We good?
okay. Did that work?
I stopped sharing.
Okay, is that okay? Can you hear me now?
Mm-hmm.
All right, so sorry about that. I always have a hard time with this particular platform. So thank you very, very much, Rebecca, for that tremendous insight. I'm going to move maybe very quickly to Antonia and really talk about, I mean, I think the challenges we've got here is that, you know, we've got an indication, we've got an initial PCODER recommendation, and as Rebecca says, it's now the standard of care. The challenges are these children that are not necessarily included in this and trying to get access to therapy for these children. So maybe what I would like to do is maybe, Antonia, maybe you can talk to us a bit about what we're doing now in terms of trying to collect feedback from families and the challenges it poses to these families if they can't get access to this therapy.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you. So for right now, what we're doing, as Rebecca mentioned, the unitoxin with irinotecan and temozolomide has been submitted to PCODER for review. And through our group ACORN, Advocacy for Canadian Childhood Oncology Research Network, CORD and OPAC, the Ontario Parents Advocating for Children with Cancer, we're working on developing the patient input response that will be a part of the application to be reviewed. And so through that, that involves interviewing patients and families in terms of understanding their experience with, whether it's with dinutuximab alone, hopefully with dinutuximab and irinotecan and temozolomide, but really try, and also so doing that through interviews and through survey analysis as well, to be able to put that information together to hopefully create a response that PCODER will see as being worthwhile in terms of going ahead and funding and approving and funding this combination for relapse therapies. I think it is, and I'm sure Shane can speak to this as well, but my son is also relapsed neuroblastoma, has been through multiple rounds of various types of immunotherapy. I think one thing that we see about this therapy is that its side effect profile, its long-term side effect profile, is not the same as traditional therapies. We are seeing, in terms of the more traditional therapies of the chemotherapy, the surgery, radiation, the long-term effects of those are certainly present major challenges for patients and families. But when we come to the immunotherapy, the short-term side effects are challenging. There's no question about that, but they are manageable. And what this presents in terms of a targeted and more precision-based therapy for this hard-to-treat population is really quite something when this is a cancer that everything is thrown at it. Nothing is really held back in terms of the treatment of neuroblastoma. So it is about trying to progress the therapy forward, trying to progress understanding how we can treat these children who have high risk refractory and relapse disease in a way that is going to hopefully reduce that longer term side effect profile for these children, which is exceptionally important. It's primarily important to be able to target this disease and be able to address it and remove it and to get as close to cure as possible. But it is also about what we see in terms of these long-term toxicities, which are problematic for our traditional therapies that the kids go through. So it is a long process, but one where we have seen, fortunately, with the funding come through for our frontline, being able to provide this in frontline, there's a few there were challenges there just because it is a more expensive therapy. But this is a population where we're seeing finally a great improvement in terms of their overall survival rates, which we have not seen for a while.
Thank you very much. So as you can imagine, for parents, of course, this is terribly frustrating if you've got a child that's in waiting and trying to get access to this. Maybe I'll switch then very quickly over to Shane and Elizabeth, and maybe have you talk a bit from, introduce yourselves, and also Shane, especially in terms of your background as well. And what does this mean to you, and what are your concerns with regard to being able to get access to this therapy for that broader population, refractory and relapse?
Well, thank you, Duran and William and Dr. Dial for inviting myself and my wife Elizabeth to this meeting here. Before we start, we have actually a guest star to briefly introduce here.
Come here. This is the reason that we are here. Come here, Andres. Gonna say hi to everybody?
Hi. Oh, hello.
Oh my gosh.
You're here.
7.
You're 7. And what grade are you in?
2.
Grade 2. And what belt are you in Taekwondo now?
Orange.
Oh, and what's your other favorite sports?
Soccer.
Soccer, yeah. So this is why we're here. Okay, so say thanks and bye-bye.
Thanks.
Say bye.
Bye.
See Dad there? Okay, bye.
Bye.
So
Great. So tell us about this. Yes.
I just like to speak to this point. And so my name is Dr. Shane Kirby. I'm a pathologist in Vancouver, and I'm the father of Andres, who presented in 2016 after an initial presentation of very subtle clinical symptoms before subsequently being diagnosed with extensive involvement by metastatic neuroblastoma, high-risk variant at 2.5 years of age. And I should probably comment here that I'm speaking as a parent and not as a physician, because both pediatric oncology and pediatric pathology are very highly subspecialized fields, and I work with adult oncologists. Now that Andres has left the room, I can be frank. Andres should be dead. And the only reason he is not dead is because of clinical trial ANBL 1221. Andres, and thank you, Dr. Dial, for giving us the treatment algorithm. Andres completely failed initial treatment protocols involving 6 months of high-dose conventional chemotherapy in preparation for planned bone marrow transplantation. And as a result, Andres received access to Unituxin as part of the clinical trial and subsequently received 17 cycles of treatment over a 2-year period. He has been disease-free since 2017. Speaking to the treatment itself, it's certainly not easy, and being in and out of hospital for 2 years, very difficult. And the treatment itself certainly has its challenges, but I think it really speaks to the power of this medication that 6 months of high-dose chemotherapy essentially did nothing. Within about, I believe it was a 4 to 5 month span, his disease burden was essentially almost completely removed. I don't work in pediatric oncology, but in my experience working with adult oncologists, I have never in my 10 years of clinical practice ever encountered a patient with his level of burden disease reaching this level after treatment with curative intent. I think it's a real statement to the power of Unituxin. And I think for any members of this webinar who are parents, I don't think it requires any further description as to the importance of adequate access to this therapy for patients and families affected by this horrible disease. I note that I was looking at the Pan-Canadian Oncology Drug Review, and access to Unituxin is limited to specific guidelines, even within those provinces for which it is currently funded. And in that limited subset of patients, it's only for 6 cycles. There was an interesting article that was published in 2016 by a parent advocate in the journal Pediatric Blood Cancer. And the title of that article was Restricting Access to Hope. And I think that was very salient. And it came at the time when dinutuximide or Unituxin was first developed and introduced, but not widely available for treatment. I do not know if the 11 additional cycles of treatment that Andres received made a difference over what is available currently with the 6 cycles. Dr. Dial would be much better able to comment to that, but it would be my hope that any Canadian children and families faced with this disease would have the same access to therapy as Andres and our family did. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And maybe I'll pivot it back to you, Rebecca, and tell us kind of what your access is to patients like, Shane and Betty's child, or some of the patients that Antonia is talking about. What are the challenges that are there, and how are you getting access to this treatment?
Yeah, so the clinical trial that we spoke about is now closed. It's completed, and I mentioned that since that time it's really become our standard of care, and that has really been through the compassionate access or patient support program from the pharmaceutical company itself. So it has made this therapy available to Canadian children, and so I'm not aware of any child that has actually gone without, in my experience to date. So they've been very supportive, but I think the question is, moving forward, making sure, we all worry that we want to maintain that access for kids that may benefit.
Okay, so this is the challenge we've got, as you say. Certainly the phase 2 clinical trials that are there, the data are somewhat limited. It is now going through, or is starting to go through, the PCODA process in terms of reimbursement. And, we understand from the company that they are not, able to provide this as compassionate access forever. you know, it either is going to have to be reimbursed or not. And I think there's a lot of concerns in terms of certainly past reviews in terms of the level of evidence that is going in as to whether or not this is going to get that same green light, given how limited it was before. So I think this is the challenge. What do other countries do? I mean, is this the same process that in your experience, and maybe, I don't know, I'm putting you on the spot as to whether or not you know or not, in terms of other jurisdictions and how they're treating the same patient population?
Yeah, I mean, I can't really speak. I do know that certainly this therapy is very much considered. I think it's fair to say in a similar position in the U.S., for example, as far as having access to it and being considered really, you know, a first line strategy in that relapsed or refractory setting. Absolutely. I can't speak to other countries, but certainly anti-GD2 antibody therapy in combination with chemotherapy is, you know, is widespread as far as its use in this population.
Okay, so I mean, I think that's our challenge: is how can we make sure that we don't have? I mean, if the company were not providing the compassionate access, then we would have a huge hole in terms of being able to make it available. And of course, the concern is what kind of recommendations coming forth, and even the time it takes to do that. So appreciate it very much. Well, don't go away. I'm going to pivot very quickly over to our other case study with regard to Kalydeco for cystic fibrosis pediatric populations, and especially around this mutation, the R711H. Sharon, is Catherine on as well?
Yes, I'm here. You can't see me, but I am here. But if you make me a presenter, I can share some slides.
Excellent. Okay, so if we can figure this out, this is actually more complicated than I can imagine. You can introduce yourself, Catherine, and then we'll pivot over to our second study and maybe come back to an overall discussion. Catherine, over to you.
Okay, lovely. And sorry, did you make me a presenter, because I don't see that?
I don't know.
Just so that I can.
Bill. Yeah, Bill in the background there. Can you do this, Bill? Does this work?
I've already done it. You should be getting a note that you're a presenter now, Catherine.
Okay. Can you see my slides, or this is just a technical difficulty after technical difficulty?
There we go. We're good. You're on. Perfect.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, so apologies to everyone. I at last minute added a photo of my face so you have some idea who is speaking to you today. This is a photo of me and my daughter Susanna, and I am here today as a parent advocate of a very cute 4-year-old who was diagnosed with cystic fibrosis at birth. And as some of you may know, cystic fibrosis is a fatal genetic disease that affects approximately 4,400 Canadians. And cystic fibrosis is inherited recessively, which means that if you are one of the 25 Canadians who has a defective gene and you have children with someone else who has that defect, your own children have a 1 in 4 chance of having this disease. Cystic fibrosis is a serious disease because it affects so many organs. It affects the pancreas. So many children and adults with cystic fibrosis need supplemental digestive enzymes to digest their food. In men, cystic fibrosis causes infertility, but the leading cause of death in cystic fibrosis is respiratory failure. There is no cure for cystic fibrosis, and a lung transplant is the only treatment option once you reach end-stage lung disease. Now, in 1989, scientists here at Sick Kids in Toronto, they found the genetic mutation. And you know, for a very short period of time, it seemed like maybe this would be easy to fix. It was not easy to fix, and in fact, we still do not have a cure, although science has come a long way. We now know that there are actually 1,700 different mutations in this gene that can cause cystic fibrosis. And they are classified according to their severity, according to a range of classes. So I won't bore you with a lot of the science here, but I'll just briefly describe that the chief problem with the defect in the cystic fibrosis gene is that the cell doesn't make the protein that is required for healthy salt and water to flow through the cellular tissue. And so this causes a lot of sticky mucus buildup throughout the organs. That's why the pancreas needs help to digest food. And then it's that mucus that causes the severe lung infections that can lead to respiratory failure. Now, this gene that scientists found back in 1989 is over here on the left. It is called the delta F508. And if you look at that percentage underneath it, you can see that of everyone in the world who has cystic fibrosis, 88% of those patients have at least one copy of this delta F508. If you look over here onto the right, when we think about R117H, which is what my daughter has and also what Sharon's children have, only 6% of the people with cystic fibrosis have one copy of this gene. This is further complicated by the fact that R117H is a gene that varies in severity. There are 3 different variants associated with this genetic mutation. If you have the 90 variant, you are generally speaking asymptomatic. In fact, you probably would never have enough disease to get diagnosed. If you have the 70 variant, you may have a variable progression of cystic fibrosis where you may have recurrent lung infections, but it may not actually shorten your life. And then this 5T variant that is associated with a more classic or severe form of cystic fibrosis. This 5T is what my child has and also what Sharon's children have. And we're challenged because we're not a large patient group. In fact, of the overall patient population, there are only 36 patients in Canada who have one R117H mutation. When we break this down into further subtypes, there are in fact only 8 children who have that 5T variant that is associated with a more classic, clinical, significant version of cystic fibrosis. Why am I talking about any of this? I'm talking about this because there is a drug that works for this genetic mutation, and pediatric patients in Canada do not have access to it with this R117H defect. Kalydeco is the name of this drug, and it was actually the very first gene modulator for cystic fibrosis that treats the underlying cause of cystic fibrosis. It actually helps that salt and water fluid move through the cellular membranes, and it acts as a potentiator. Again, a potentiator because it helps more of the salt and water get to the cellular tissue. This is a photo from the website, the Kalydeco website, where the drug manufacturer has again shown how this just opens up those channels so that more of those chloride ions can get through the cellular surface. Now, this is important because gene modulators are not a cure. You know, once lung damage or other organ damage has occurred, a gene modulator cannot reverse any of that damage. So starting these gene modulators when children are young, you know, before they have severe symptoms is really important. And again, our children do not have access to this drug. Now, I briefly want to share a comparison of some drug approval timelines. Here in Health Canada, this drug was actually first approved in 2012. And it was originally approved for a very specific CFTR genotype called G115D. And then as clinical studies progressed, it got approval for 8 more mutations. And then in 2014, it was approved for R117H, but Health Canada made the decision to restrict this to adults only. Why did they do this? There are 3 reasons. Number 1, original studies did not separate the 5T variant from those 70 and 90 populations. And so as a result, when you run the overall aggregate study data, there was determined to be an uncertain clinical benefit. You could have very severe cystic fibrosis or perhaps very few symptoms at all. And since there was uncertain clinical benefit, particularly in this pediatric population, it did not receive approval. But one of the reasons that 5T was not isolated in the first place is that this is already a rare mutation. And when you start subdividing a rare mutation into increasingly smaller subtypes, it's hard to get enough people to even make a clinical trial possible, given all of the rigor that's required in that. So by comparison, in the United States, the FDA had the same 2012 and same 2013 approval, but in 2014, they expanded the R117H to say that anyone over the age of 12 could take this if they had that R117H. And it did not matter whether you had the 5, 7, or 90. As clinical trials progressed, children aged 2 and above were given access in 2015. And then again, as clinical trials continue to work their way through the pipelines, you can now take this, you can now take Kalydeco as young as 4 months. Now, Europe becomes a really interesting case study for us because the EMA originally followed the same decision that Canada did, where they restricted access in 2014 only to adult R178 patients. However, recently, as of 2012, they have looked into the real world data coming from the United States, where we have seen R178 patients on Kalydeco now for 6 years, and they have seen that it works. And so now the EMA has revised that original approval, and you can now take R178 as young as, or sorry, you can now take Kalydeco if you have an R117H mutation as young as 4 months. So the takeaway here is that we're fighting to get the same access for our own children because it is so crucial for our children to have this drug before they end up with the irreversible damage. And with that, I'll pass it on to Sharon, who can explain a little bit more about her advocacy in getting this drug.
Brilliant. Thank you. Sharon?
Hi, thank you. I'll go through this pretty quickly because I know we're running short on time, but yeah, my name is Sharon. I am a mother of 3 children, 2 of whom have cystic fibrosis, my oldest and my youngest. I am an advocate in Alberta. I became an advocate because I want all Albertans and people across Canada to have access to modulators, because I think that they are a proactive approach to treating this disease. Everything else we do, and it is time intensive and it is expensive and draining and difficult, is reactive. We have amazing care that we receive from our clinic, but everything we do is reactive, from all our hospital admissions and the daily treatments and the bronchoscopies and the x-rays and the CT scans, and everything that we do is trying to treat the disease as it's attacking the body. I want to see us getting a drug that is treating the underlying cause and slowing the progression. So my kids are the perfect example of kids who have R178H that are symptomatic. The newborn screen wasn't available when my daughter was born, and my son actually ended up passing the newborn screen just because they have some function, and they were diagnosed based on symptoms. My daughter people thought that she had all these different things wrong with her, up to possibly having cancer, and it turned out that they had CF. And so for me to hear that R178H is only something that affects people when they're adults, that is completely untrue. And the many hours that I log at that hospital, I would say, would prove that as well. I think that there's a lot of long-term costs associated with not being able to access these modulators earlier on. The disease progression that my daughter will see, pointing to her, she's older and has more disease progression. By the time she reaches 18, we'll be lucky to have 60% lung function. That lung function cannot be restored. And you ideally, to be getting on these modulators once you're still at 80% lung function is what you want to do. You want to get there before you have severe disease progression. You want to still have the ability to have a good quality of life. As a parent, as an advocate, as a Canadian, I think that you need to take care of your citizens, and you need to be able to access these medications in a timely manner so that, that we can participate in society. We're not a huge strain on the healthcare system because it's a very intensive disease to manage it constantly. And my kids can go to university full time, they can have career aspirations. Those things are all possible if they can get on these modulators now. If we wait until they are 18 years old, they will do some of those things, but I think at half measures. And every year that they're not on them, I know is shaving years off of their life. I feel like the rest of our cohort, people who can use Kalydeco, were granted access to it when it was approved by the government, and that we were left behind. I feel that the fact that we are a really small group and with the variables that we have, and it was difficult to incorporate us, I feel that we were discriminated against. We were kind of an oversight, and I feel it's something that should be rectified. I know that Health Canada is trying to put into place different processes that'll make it easier and faster for pediatrics to gain access to these drugs, but it can't come soon enough for people like my kids, because as the years go by and you can see the whole process that it takes for a drug to be approved, from going to Health Canada and CADTH and PMPRB and the PCPA and getting added to provincial drug plans, those are years off my kid's life. And there needs to be a faster and easier way for kids to access it. And it can't just be for end of stage special access programs, because that doesn't work for everyone. Not everyone is at end stages, which I hope that CF patients aren't at end stages in their pediatric times. And we need a quicker, easier way to be able to access them.
Well, I'm going to stop for a second, Sharon, just because I want to make sure that we get a chance to do a sort of an overall wrap up. So if you don't mind, is that okay? I know that you probably could tell us more in terms of the story, but I just want to bring it back to the overall discussion, because I think that is the takeaway, is that we are trapped in many respects with the kind of access that we provide for rare disease drugs. And sometimes, as you say, it's that long delay timeline, or it's the ability to expand the access in the same way that other countries are. What would you hope for? And I'm going to go back to everybody. What would you like to see? We're at the opportunity to say we can create a rare drug strategy. The federal government says, I'm going to give you $1 billion to set this up. What would you want to see differently that would actually improve the access for patients that you're seeing? I'm going to start back with you, Rebecca. You know, given the patients that you're seeing, and not just with neuroblastoma maybe, but around this, what would make the difference?
I mean, I think it's a bit of a time potentially for a bit of a paradigm shift when it comes to not only really rare diseases where the levels of evidence that may be possible just aren't big enough, aren't large enough. You know, the randomized phase 3 trials may not be feasible, but also just thinking about as we move into more and more molecularly targeted drugs, where you're, instead of treating all of one cancer type with conventional chemotherapy, there may be a small pocket, almost like the cystic fibrosis story, a small pocket within that cancer type that may respond really well to drug X. And so the clinical trials that may be possible are going to be smaller. They're going to be phase 2 basket studies, and I think moving towards a bit of a paradigm shift from a drug review process and thinking about how do we prove benefit, and looking at what are our outcomes of efficacy and cost effectiveness. I think the time is now to make some of those shifts.
Yeah, I love what you're saying. I mean, we seem to be trapped in sort of approval processes that were designed for drugs that were last century as opposed to this century. I mean, Antonia, I see you nodding there. What are you saying here? And for certainly, you've been faced with a lot of parents, childhood cancer.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Rebecca's absolutely right. And I think when it comes to the approval process, what I would really love to see would be the adoption of something like a conditional approval. So where CADTH says, yes, this looks good, we're going to fund it. We realize that this is a small patient population and that we need to collect more data, but instead of it's a black and white yes or no, that it gets approved or not, to say, okay, yes, it's a conditional approval. Let's see where the data goes. If the data doesn't go in the right direction, you pull that conditional approval. If the data is and continues to go in the right direction, then you move towards that full approval. But I think we need to create a system which provides that flexibility. And then if you do, when you're in conditional approval, you could still go forward with the other pieces of the process in terms of the drug negotiation and the provincial listings, so that when you get to that full approval, that you are not way behind in terms of the time. As Sharon said, the amount of time that it takes to go through the entire process it's too long. So we need to figure out ways to shrink that, to make sure that we are reacting as quickly as possible with the data that's necessary. But maybe it's not from that phase 3 trial anymore, but looking at it as sort of a long-term data collection.
So for Sharon and Catherine, pivoting back, as you're saying very, very eloquently, Sharon, what would that mean for you in terms of a process that would say we start with a conditional approval and then we collect that information and we go forth, and, if the kids don't respond, then they, come off therapy. But if they do respond, instead of waiting for us to be able to accumulate all of that evidence, and I know we keep talking about real world evidence, but we've not seen any evidence that we actually use real world evidence in our approval processes.
100%. I would love to see more clinician input on those types of things. I know that a lot of the fantastic care that we get at our clinic is based on clinical data, and I would like to see the clinicians have a little more power to decide that, this subset of this group would respond really well. We've been told since Asha was diagnosed that she should be on Kalydeco, and yet there's all these barriers in our way. And I think that, and I know the clinicians would like to see everyone on a modulator, and maybe that's not possible, but I do know that when something like Pomazine was originally offered in clinic, they got a certain amount of prescriptions and they were able to give them to the patients that needed it the most. And then once that proved quite effective, then it was available to all patients. So a model like that is, I know I'm not part of the Health Canada side of things, but that ideally that would be wonderful.
And Shane, back to you. I mean, quite frankly, you're out of it. Your kid is doing well. What are you advocating for now? Why are you still here?
Well, Elizabeth and myself and Andres are all very fortunate for the access that he's had and his current health. We're on the leading wave of changes to treatments. I work closely with Dr. Cheng and Lee, who's medical laboratory director at the BC Cancer Agency, and we're entering the era of whole genome sequencing of tumors, and there's going to be a wave of new targets. So the problems with these expensive drugs is going to keep going forward. But I think, as Sharon very eloquently said, there's also a high cost associated with these drugs. There's also a high cost with not getting timely access to the drugs. And although I don't work in pediatric oncology, I do see the consequences in adults of exposure to high-dose chemotherapy, subsequent myelodysplastic syndrome, subsequent myeloproliferative disorders secondary to chemotherapy that are not benign drugs. And I think as Canadians, we would all hope that especially children of all people should have the access to the best medications that are available.
I mean, and that's a different point, right? And Shane's very important, is that sometimes we make patients cycle through all the older therapies and they have to, quote, fail all these older therapies that we know have huge toxicity, that actually are going to have lasting effects, as you say, before we get them to the best therapy. So why not make sure that the best therapy is available? We're just about out of time, but I'm going to pivot to Catherine, give you the last word in here, Catherine. I know that you're a disembodied voice, but I think you've been very powerful in your presentation here. What do you what would you hope to happen? You've got a 4-year-old.
Yeah, it's been very difficult because she was born after Kalydeco was approved in the FDA. So I have known since she was born that if we lived, I live in London, Ontario. So if I lived 90 minutes south, my daughter would have a very different life. I would love for clinicians and respirologists who are highly trained specialists in this field to have the final word and whether or not children would benefit from these clinical therapies. I just do not think it makes sense for regulators to be determining this cutting edge specialized medicine when respirologists know their patients best, but they also know the medicine and the data in these specific diseases best as well.
Thank you very much. And you certainly know your data very well and presented it brilliantly for us. So we appreciate that very much. We are right at the end of it. I really want to thank everybody that came on with your personal commitments, your personal stories, but also kind of shining for us the importance of having a rare drug program that's actually going to be able to address this. And this is our big challenge, right? Is we do want to make sure that, as I say, the rarest of the rare need to also be included in this, and we don't actually leave anyone behind as we're putting this together. So these are the kinds of examples that are so very important for us to pay attention to. We are going to be spending a whole year, I think, to do this consultation, and we are going to invite all of you to come back with us and help us in terms of designing this and to put forth this powerful case. It is the personal examples, the personal stories, and I think what you're hearing, Dr. Dial, is very much back to, we need to set up a system which clinicians have a great deal more, role in being able to determine whether these therapies work, how they work, who should be made available, and then setting up the monitoring so that we can determine, whether or not this is going forward. So huge thanks to all of you for the time, and a huge reminder then back to those who are listening. This is the last of our specific webinars in the fall series. We do have a one-day forum that's taking place on the 16th of December. If you haven't signed up for it, do go into our website and register for it. You'll see more details on it, and keep aware, because next year we're going to bring to you a whole lot more in terms of consultation opportunities to really make sure we have the chance. We could design, somebody said to us, and some others, it says, we don't actually have the worst system in the world, but we do have a system that's really falling behind many others. But it is an opportunity to get to the first. And so, we want to take best advantage of this opportunity and using the situations in front of us. So hopefully for Sharon and Catherine, we're going to get this solved sooner rather than later. But thank you so very much. And thank you again, Antonia and Rebecca, for your huge contribution and your ongoing work on behalf of everybody, and Shane as well. So thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.